Okay, so we've discussed the rise of mestizo nationalism and we've discussed the Mexican Revolution. Today we're going to be looking at nationalism in action throughout Latin America prior to the Second World War. Principally, we're going to be focusing here on the political and economic actions of nationalism. We'll be looking at the cultural a little bit later. So when we're talking about the political and the economic, central tenets here are resistance to foreign influence through increasing domestic economic power, meaning here the creation of industry and the centralization of capital within the actual Latin American country as opposed to capital coming from the United States or from Europe. Additionally, the celebration and protection of local population and culture. As I mentioned, we're going to look at culture a little bit later on in a different lecture, but what we're really going to be looking at here is the idea of the protection of people. As industrialization takes hold, nationalist governments make it their job to help protect Latin American workers. So let's look at some examples of what nationalism looks like in other parts of Latin America. So in Uruguay, you have José Balje y Ordóñez. He creates a group of, Uruguay, this tiny little country, Ordóñez actually does a fairly good job of building up the Uruguayan economy through nationalism and especially protectionism. For example, he creates tariffs to protect local industries. In other words, he creates taxes that make it expensive for foreign goods to come into Uruguay. And so you then can stimulate the production of those goods domestically. He creates government control over utilities, so the electricity, water, trains, all these things which had previously been controlled by foreign companies get now centralized, not only by an Uruguayan company, but literally by the Uruguayan government. Additionally, he created state-owned banks. So again, all of that foreign capital from Britain, the United States, etc., he's not interested in that. And so the government in Uruguay begins running the banks. And then lastly, he creates the first real Latin American welfare state. And what I mean by welfare state is the idea that there are certain things that the government needs to do to take care of its citizens. Things like, for example, healthcare, unemployment insurance. The government paid for vacations. Labor regulation to make sure that there aren't any abuses in any of the privately owned industries. Social Security would be another example of the welfare state that we have here in the United States. And so that is Ordóñez in Uruguay. There we go. That's a little better, isn't it? There we go. The next guy we're going to look at is Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico. He becomes the president after about 2 decades after the beginning of the revolution, and he creates a gigantic land redistribution system. The amount of land that he gives away is more than basically had been given away the 2.5 decades before him. Or give or take, about 45 million acres go from go from church or state holding all the way to the poor. Additionally, he supports Mexican workers against foreign companies. So there's a series of strikes that happen against foreign companies by the workers, and the Mexican government comes to the support of the striking workers. The biggest case is in the oil industry, which is entirely owned by foreign companies. When the oil industry refuses to obey the orders of the Mexican Supreme Court to increase the wages of their workers, Cárdenas literally takes over the oil industry. He takes all of the property away from the oil companies and says, this is Mexican property now. And he creates Pemex, which is the Mexican state-owned oil company, and still is today. So that was happening in Mexico. In Brazil, you get Getúlio Vargas. We're going to talk about Vargas a little bit later when we talk about culture, a celebration of mestizo culture, and also about populism. But Vargas takes over in the 1930s. He establishes a dictatorship, which we'll talk about later as well. But under Vargas's regime, you see a gigantic expansion of government agencies. The alphabet soup, as they say in the U.S., of the different agencies that Franklin Delano Roosevelt created during the New Deal. This is basically kind of like a Brazilian version of that. Huge number of government agencies are created which generate a lot of jobs both within the government helping run the agencies, but also things like public works, so that these government agencies are also putting people to work. He also creates a series of state-run industries, just a couple of which are up there. National steel industry, he creates a national engine industry as well. And he takes it a step further, more than anyone else that's up here, by stressing assimilation and the idea of a Brazil first in media. So Brazil, and a lot of people don't know this, has a gigantic immigrant population. Brazil received the second largest number of Germans outside of the United States. Brazil has a really substantial Japanese population. Sao Paulo is the largest Japanese city outside of Japan. The city with the largest Japanese population outside of Japan. And so there are also large numbers of Italians, and they sort of control the winemaking industry. Vargas decides that he is done with the idea of people not assimilating. And so he creates a kind of national culture and says, that's it, and this has to happen. So he literally makes it illegal to walk on the streets and speak things other than Portuguese. There are people who get thrown in jail for speaking languages other than Portuguese. Obviously, if you don't know Portuguese and you find yourself speaking it, that might be a different story. But if you're, say, a German immigrant, many of whom were still speaking German at the time, and who choose to speak German instead of Portuguese, it's literally against the law. Also, he bans all foreign language newspapers, makes them switch over to Portuguese, and any foreign-owned newspapers, they have to sell to a Brazilian company. And so he eliminates any language other than Portuguese in the media. Again, this all relates back to the idea of the celebration of local culture, as well as the celebration of the local worker. Speaking of the local worker, the next big idea, one of the big ideas that the nationalists used was called import substitution industrialization, or sometimes just referred to as ISI. Import substitution industrialization, it's a big word. What does that mean? Or a big bunch of words. What does that mean? So this is the fundamental economic policy of nationalists. It doesn't happen all over Latin America. You need a fairly big market and a fairly developed, economy in order to do this. But mainly we're talking here about Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. In 1929, the Great Depression hits, and world trade comes to a virtual halt. And up until this point, if you remember back to the idea of progress, all that Latin America is doing is growing stuff, exporting it, and then using that money from exports to buy everything else from other countries. Import other things, whether, any kind of manufactured stuff pretty much is produced overseas. With the Great Depression, basically the flow of goods coming from countries like the United States, France, Germany, Britain, dries up. Those countries no longer have money with which to trade, and so they are no longer buying the exports from Latin America, and Latin America finds itself in a unfortunate position. And so the nationalists use this to create local trade systems, local industrial economies. So they use state power to create local industries. What do I mean when I say state power? If a government decides that a country is going to start producing something, governments have way more power than private companies. For example, the government's allowed to set wages. They can say how much the workers are going to end up getting paid. They can also manipulate the currency, something generally is thought that China is doing today, depending on who you talk to, it doesn't matter, that they can make it cheaper for them to export their goods, or more expensive for companies to import things. And also, they can, and I put in quotes here, work with the unions. And we'll talk about this when we talk about populism, but they, long and short of it, they integrate unions into some of the decision-making, and in doing so, prevent unions from striking, make it illegal to strike. And the result of this is the creation of light industries in Mexico and in the Southern Cone. What do I mean by light industries? I'm talking here about making beer, making wine, making soap, making clothing, making furniture. All your heavy industries, such as making automobiles, making tractors, making machines, big heavy machines, requires a kind of steel industry that simply isn't available in Latin America. There's some steel, but not enough. And so this is successful, however, in creating these light industries in Latin America that prior to the Great Depression would have been virtually impossible because it was just too easy to get the stuff from overseas. Okay, so that is the economics behind the nationalist economic approach. So what are some of our big ideas here? We talked about the Mexican Revolution. Just like in the Mexican Revolution, this shows the rise of resistance to foreign influence. In this case, a rise to resistance to foreign economic influence. So that old mindset, remember the liberals, guys like Sarmiento and others as well, that foreign influence, cultural, economic, racial, all of that is good because Latin America needs help. It needs the influence of Europeans. It needs the money from the Americans. And we need this foreign influence in order to civilize Latin America. And this nationalism in action illustrates a shift away from that. The foreign influence is basically invasive, meaning it's something that does not naturally belong. And not only is foreign influence invasive, it's foreign influence that explains why Latin America has not economically developed as much as the rest of the world. It kind of flips the script, wherein 19th century liberals said, we need foreign influence in order to compete. 20th century nationalists say, absolutely not. We need a lack of foreign influence to build ourselves up, and then we can start to open up trade again and start to compete internationally. All right, so next lecture, I think we're going to be looking at cultural celebrations, especially in Brazil, of the idea of mestiçagem, the miscegenation, the mixing of races, mestizoism, with authors such as Gilberto Freire. Thanks.